Hello again. I'm always vastly amused when I hear older people talk about what great childhoods they had and how they used to leave home alone in the morning to play outdoors with their friends, only returning home at tea time. Of course, the world was a safer place in those days, wasn't it? There were fewer cars and not so many dangerous people around. None of all these dreadful guns and knives that we see so much about in the newspapers. The reason that this kind of thing makes me laugh is because it is all completely untrue. Let's stop for a moment and consider one or two facts. There certainly were fewer cars on the roads of Britain 50 years ago. There are 3 times as many cars in Britain today as there were in 1971. Surely that means that there is more hazard for children crossing the road these days. In an average year in this country, about 20 young people under the age of 16 are knocked down and killed by cars. How many do viewers think were killed in this way by cars in 1965? The answer is that over 900 child pedestrians were knocked down and killed by cars that year, 45 times as many as is now the case. It was absolute carnage for those kids who were out and about on their own in those days, the ones that didn't come home till tea time. Nearly 1,000 of them didn't come home at all. It's not hard really to see why. In the 1960s, children as young as 4 and 5, or even 3, were allowed out in the street without an adult. Perhaps there'd be with an older brother or sister, but not always. But in any case, you can't really expect a 10-year-old to watch over a smaller child. The very freedom which children had in those days resulted in an appalling number of deaths. Okay, it might be true that children were more likely to be run over in those days, but surely there were not such dreadful murders as we see today. On the afternoon of 25th of May 1968, 4-year-old Martin Brown went alone into a sweet shop in the Scotsford district of Newcastle upon Tyne. Wilson Dixon, who served him, thought nothing more about it once the little boy had left the shop. A 4-year-old visiting shops by himself simply wasn't a remarkable or noteworthy occurrence in those days. Let's just pause for a moment and imagine these days a 4-year-old walking to the shops and back by himself. The brief sighting by a shop assistant on that Saturday afternoon almost 50 years ago was the last time that anybody other than his killer saw Martin Brown alive. Later that day, the little boy's body was found in a derelict house near the sweet shop. There were no marks on the dead child and no reason to suspect foul play, and an open verdict was returned at the subsequent inquest. 2 months later, an even younger child was out and about without an adult. Brian Howe was just 3 years old and he was playing out in the streets alone. He was lured to a piece of waste ground by 2 girls, one of whom was 11 and the other 13. There the child was strangled and his corpse mutilated. An attempt was made to skin his penis with a razor blade. Eventually the girls were arrested for Brian Howe's murder, and then it became clear that Martin Brown had also died after being abducted and attacked by one or both of the 2 children implicated in the killing and mutilation of Brian Howe. The younger of the 2 children had been 10 when Martin Brown died. At the subsequent trial, the older of the children was acquitted, but 11-year-old Mary Bell was convicted of the manslaughter of both the little boys. Unfortunately, this is the kind of thing which can happen when you let 3 and 4-year-olds walk about the streets alone and they meet a 10-year-old who is a bit disturbed and also out and about without her parents. Murders of that sort, of children by children, were no rarer in the 1960s than they are today. Still, what about knife crime among children? Surely that has shot up in recent years. Unfortunately, there are no reliable records of how many children and young people were stabbing each other in those days. It was common enough, though. In December 1960, 13-year-old John Day was taken to hospital in Tilbury after being stabbed in the course of a fight in a school playground. Knives were being used by youths on the street that month, as well as in school playgrounds. 2 weeks after John Day was stabbed at school, 17-year-old Keith Munsey was stabbed to death in a street fight. The 16-year-old boy who was charged with his murder apparently accused the dead boy of staring at him. The remarkable thing about knife crime among young people during the 1960s is that it didn't make the headlines, being viewed as not especially newsworthy. The stabbing of 13-year-old John Day rated only 4 lines in the Times, appearing in the other news section. An increase of a halfpenny in the price of a loaf of bread was seen as more important, this item appearing before news of the school stabbing. Here's another school stabbing, this time from 1963. A 13-year-old boy at a school in Old Trafford stabbed a fellow pupil during a lesson to make him jump. At Manchester County Juvenile Court, he was put on probation for 2 years. Some of this schoolboy knife crime was more serious than simply stabbing a fellow pupil and leaving a superficial wound. In 1966, P.C. Brian Armstrong was stabbed to death in Gateshead while questioning a 14-year-old schoolboy. The child was later charged with the police officer's murder. The weapon used was the traditional schoolboy's penknife. Just imagine the conclusions which would be drawn about the terrible state of childhood in the modern world if we read in tomorrow's newspaper about a policeman being stabbed to death by a schoolboy. Throughout the 1960s, knife crime among children and young people came in waves. In May 1968, 15-year-old Clive Chambers was stabbed during a playground fight at Holloway Boys' School in North London. A boy of the same age was arrested after the incident. The following month, 13-year-old Joseph Gill was stabbed in the playground of St Bonaventure's School. Another pupil at the school appeared in court charged with wounding. At any period in English history you care to look at, and I'm talking now about going back to the medieval period, children are stabbing each other and also sometimes hacking away at adults. In the quiet Cheshire town of Nantwich in February 1926, a schoolboy was stabbed in the back by another pupil. The wounding apparently resulted from 2 older boys pretending to fight each other with penknives, and the injured schoolboy simply got in the way. Less than a year later in Castleford, a town in the north of England, 2 schoolboys stole a couple of penknives from a shop. They then walked down the street, stabbing girls in the legs as they went. They were later charged with unlawful wounding. In that same month, January 1927, 14-year-old schoolboy called Arthur Edward Shillibere appeared at the Old Bailey in London, charged with murdering a 13-year-old boy by stabbing him. This was a gang-related killing. A group of boys in the South London district of Bermondsey, all aged between 12 and 15, were terrorising the neighbourhood by their violent activities. 11 of the gang cornered Arthur Shillibere, and in defence he took out his knife and used it to kill the leader of the gang. Because of the nature of the crime, the charge of murder was dropped and a plea of manslaughter accepted by the prosecution. Here's a tale of teenage gang violence in the inner cities which could have come straight from today's newspapers. It happened less than a decade after the end of the First World War. Gang murders in 1927, policeman stabbed to death by a 14-year-old boy in 1966. These are the kind of crimes which we like to think of as being a terrifying sign of the moral decline of present-day society. I fear there never was a golden age where children could play out safely, free of the risk of being killed by traffic or even getting knifed by other kids.